The document in Matthew Sutton's hand was shaking, though he told himself it was the wind coming through the gaps in the barn wall. It was not the wind. It was his own hand, trembling with a fury so compressed and controlled it had nowhere left to go but into his fingers, into the paper, into the crease where the words had been written in ink so dark it looked like dried blood against the pale page. "You had no right," he said. Lillian Grayson stood 10 feet from him in the center of the barn, her boots planted in the straw, her chin lifted at an angle that made it absolutely clear she was not going to flinch. She had ridden 300 miles from Missouri. She had buried a husband, survived a flood that swallowed half a county, and talked her way past 2 armed men at the county land office in Abilene. She was not going to flinch at a rancher holding a piece of paper like it was a loaded rifle. "I had every right," she said. "The deed is in my name, has been since October. You should have checked before you started telling people this land was forfeit. My attorney told me. Your attorney lied to you or you lied to yourself, which is a worse habit and harder to cure." She pulled her coat tighter against the December cold, and the motion was so deliberate, so unhurried, that it made his jaw tighten. "I am not leaving, Mr. Sutton. I am not selling, and I am not negotiating from the position of a woman who does not know what she owns." Matthew looked at her for a long moment. The lantern hanging from the post above them cast a yellow light across the side of her face, and he could see the exhaustion beneath the steel in her eyes. She had been traveling. She had come a long way, and she was still standing like she had not moved a muscle in years. "You don't understand what you've walked into," he said, and his voice had dropped, the anger shifting into something that sounded almost like warning, almost like fear. "Then explain it to me," Lillian said. "But understand, I have seen things that would make most men sit down and weep, so whatever darkness you think this land is carrying, whatever secrets you think I'm too tender to hear, save your breath and just say the words plainly." He looked at her, and something cracked open behind his eyes that he had not planned for. "The land is dry," he said slowly, as though each word cost him something. "The winters here are long, longer than anything Missouri ever showed you. People come out here full of intention and they break. It is not a weakness. It is just the truth of this place." Lillian tilted her head, and when she spoke, there was no cruelty in it, but there was iron, and there was something else, something that sounded, impossibly, like recognition. "I have seen longer," she said. "That was how it began. Or rather, that was where it arrived, at that precise collision of 2 people who had each, separately, been ground down by the world, until only the hardest part of them remained, meeting in a cold barn in December of 1878, on the Kansas plains, with a legal dispute between them and everything else that would come after still hidden in the future like water under rock. To understand how they got there, you had to go back to the previous September, to a gray morning in St. Joseph, Missouri, when Lillian Grayson had walked into a solicitor's office with a letter from her late husband, and a look on her face that told the clerk behind the desk he ought to answer her questions honestly. Her husband, Daniel Grayson, had been dead for 7 months by that point. He had died of pneumonia in February, leaving behind a modest amount of debt, a small house that belonged to the bank before the funeral was finished, and a letter he had written 2 years prior and never mailed, about a parcel of land in Garfield County, Kansas, that he had purchased sight unseen from a man named Horace Gill, who had come through St. Joseph selling parcels like most men sold pocket watches, with great enthusiasm and considerable invention. The letter was never mailed because Daniel had been embarrassed. He had spent money they did not have on land he had never seen in a territory he had no plan to reach, and when the fever took him and left Lillian alone in February with the snow still heavy on the ground and the creditors already making inquiries, the letter stayed in the drawer of his desk, folded under a photograph of them from their wedding day. She found it in March, when she was clearing his things. She sat at the table for a long time after reading it. The fire had gone low, and she did not get up to add wood. She just sat and thought, the way she had been trained not to do by years of a practical life that demanded action over reflection. And what she thought about was this. Daniel had been a man with large dreams that his body could not keep pace with. He had wanted to go west. He had talked about it in the early years of their marriage with the kind of enthusiasm that made her love him even when she knew, in the sensible back part of her mind, that it would never happen. And then it did not happen, and he was gone, and the dream was in an unmailed letter in a desk drawer with a deed she had not known existed. The deed was real. She had a solicitor verify it. The land in Garfield County, Kansas, 90 acres of high plains grassland with a creek running along the southern edge that may or may not have still been running, was legally titled to Daniel Grayson, and upon his death, to his wife. Lillian was 31 years old. She had no children, no family left in Missouri to speak of, no house, and a small amount of savings she had been carefully protecting for 8 months since Daniel's death by taking in washing and teaching letters to the younger children of her neighbor, Mrs. Hartwell. She had a reputation in her neighborhood for being unusually composed under pressure and slightly terrifying when anyone tried to take advantage of her, which was something the men who had worked with Daniel had discovered when they came to call about the debts. She had paid what was owed and sent the rest away with a courtesy that left no room for argument. The land in Kansas was not an opportunity she had asked for. But she looked at it the way she looked at everything directly, without the softening filter of what she wished it were, and she thought, this is what there is. She spent 3 weeks reading everything she could find in St. Joseph about Kansas, about farming and ranching on the high plains, about water rights and fencing laws, and the particular cruelty of the winters out there. She talked to people who had been. She talked to 2 women at the dry goods store whose husbands had gone out ahead and sent for them and never sent again. She talked to a man named Prout who had come back from Kansas after 2 years, missing 2 fingers and with a hollowness in his face that spoke of things he had not processed yet. She made a list. She made 2 lists. She crossed things out and rewrote them. She made a budget. She bought what she needed. Heavy wool, a good pair of boots with double stitching, seeds, 2 revolvers she knew how to use because Daniel had been particular about that, a medical kit, tools, and a train ticket from St. Joseph to Dodge City, with the remainder of the journey to be made by wagon. She arrived in Dodge City in late September of 1878, when the cattle drives had mostly wound down for the year, and the town was in that brief exhale between the chaos of summer and the quiet of winter. She hired a wagon from a man at the livery named Porter who charged her a fair price, after she pointed out he had told her a different price than he'd told the man before her. She bought supplies she had not been able to carry from Missouri. She asked specific questions at the land office and was given vague answers by a clerk who seemed surprised that she was asking them at all. It was at the land office in Dodge City that she first heard the name Matthew Sutton. "You say this parcel is in Garfield County," the clerk said, pulling out a ledger with the weariness of a man who found his job a personal insult. 90 acres along Dry Creek Road. He ran his finger down the page and stopped, and something shifted in his expression, a small flicker of something that was either recognition or trouble, and in Lillian's experience the 2 were nearly always the same thing. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "No problem." He closed the ledger. "Just that land's been sitting idle. There's been some question about it." "What kind of question?" "Well, ma'am, Matthew Sutton. He's the rancher whose land borders yours to the north and west. He filed a notice of abandonment in July. Said the parcel had been unoccupied for over 2 years, which under county ordinance allows an adjacent landowner to make a claim pending." "Pending what?" Lillian said, "Pending proof of active ownership." She looked at the man for a long moment. "What constitutes proof? Occupancy, physical improvement, tax payment, any of the 3. And the taxes," he opened the ledger again reluctantly, "paid August in the name of Lillian Grayson." He looked up. "You paid them?" "I paid them in August, yes," Lillian said, "from Missouri through a bank draft to the county. I have the receipt. She opened her bag and produced it without theater. So the notice of abandonment is invalid. The clerk looked at the receipt. He looked at his ledger. He looked at Lillian. That would be yes, ma'am. Technically you would need to present that to the county judge. Fine. Who is the county judge? It took her 4 days. She presented the receipt. She presented the deed. She presented the marriage certificate and death certificate establishing her status as successor owner. And she presented herself in a manner that made the county judge, a stout man named Albrecht, decide it was in everyone's interest to resolve the matter quickly and clearly in her favor. He issued a written ruling confirming her ownership, stamped it, signed it, and handed it to her across a desk that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. She rode to the Sutton Ranch with it 3 days later, in early December, having first spent 2 weeks at a boarding house in the small town of Culver, establishing that she existed, that she was serious, and that she could withstand the wind that came across the plains like something with a personal grievance. The Sutton Ranch was larger than she had expected. It sprawled across the northern high ground in a way that said money and labor and years, not the money of luxury but the money of survival compounded over time. The main house was stone and timber, 2 stories, smoke coming from the chimney. The barn was large. There were outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a water trough that had been properly maintained. Cattle moved in the far field, the dark shapes of them slow and indifferent against the pale winter grass. The man who came out of the barn when she rode up was not what she had built in her mind during the journey from Dodge City. She had constructed a particular type, older, thick, the kind of man who had forgotten that other people had rights because no one had reminded him in long enough. The kind of man who filed abandonment notices as a matter of habit, the way some people rearranged furniture, not out of need, but out of the unconscious conviction that everything within reach was theirs to reorder. Matthew Sutton was in his mid-30s, lean without being thin, with the particular kind of posture that comes not from discipline but from years of physical work that had simply built him that way. His face was weathered, which was not surprising, but it was also, and this was the part that surprised her, not a closed face. It was a face that had been through something, several somethings, and had not yet entirely decided how to present itself on the other side. There was a watchfulness in his eyes, dark brown and direct, that she recognized because she saw it in her own mirror most mornings. He had not known she was coming. She could see that. He had come out of the barn with his coat half on and his expression that of a man interrupted in a task, and when she stopped the wagon and got down and introduced herself, the coat froze on his shoulders and his face did the thing that faces do when the name lands in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Lillian Grayson," he repeated. "The same," she said. She handed him the ruling. He read it, and that was when she first saw the anger, not the bluster she had expected but something deeper and more specific, like a man who had not been expecting to be wrong and was now recalibrating around it, which was always more dangerous and more interesting than a man who was simply used to losing. "Come inside," he said after a long moment. "I am fine here," she said, and they had stood in the cold in front of the barn and he had told her the land was dry and the winters were long, and she had looked at him with that particular expression of a woman who has been underestimated so many times it has stopped being offensive and started being useful, and told him she had seen longer. He fed her supper anyway. She had not expected that, and she took it as information rather than kindness, which turned out to be only half right, which was something she would not discover until later. The kitchen in the Sutton Ranch house was warmer than the outside world by a degree that made her realize how cold she had been without noticing. The cook was a woman named Rosa, who had been with the ranch for years, and who looked at Lillian with the frank assessment of someone who has watched many different kinds of people walk through a door, and has become very accurate about which kind survives and which kind does not. Rosa apparently decided something in those first few seconds, and served Lillian a plate of beans and salt pork and cornbread, without being asked, and without commentary, which Lillian appreciated as one of the better forms of hospitality she had encountered. Matthew sat across from her at the table with a cup of coffee he was not drinking, the ruling still on the table between them, and they began to talk, not about the land, not immediately, but around it, which was the way serious conversations between careful people always began. She learned that he had owned the Sutton Ranch for 11 years, having come out from Ohio at 24 with money borrowed from his father and a plan that had failed in its specific form and succeeded in its general one. He had bought the land adjoining hers, that is, adjoining the Grayson parcel 4 years ago when he had expanded, and when the parcel had sat empty for 2 full years with no sign of activity, he had done what his attorney advised and filed the notice. He had not expected someone to appear with a paid tax receipt and a county judge's ruling. He had, in fact, been in the process of clearing the land along the creek to extend his winter grazing. "You were going to graze your cattle on my land," Lillian said. "I was going to use unoccupied land legally within county ordinance," he said, "which it was until August. It was never unoccupied in the sense that matters," she said. "It was owned. There is a difference between a house standing empty and a house abandoned." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people would not make that distinction. Most people are not careful," she said, and helped herself to more cornbread. He watched her do it. He watched her the way he had been watching her since she arrived, with that carefully maintained attention that was trying to look like nothing, trying to look like mere assessment, and failing slightly at the edges in a way he did not appear to be aware of. "What do you intend to do with it?" he asked. "Farm it." "You cannot farm it," he said, and the words came out with a flatness that was not cruelty but was not kindness either. It was just the blunt delivery of what he believed to be fact. "The soil is poor along that stretch, too much rock near the surface. The creek is dry half the year. You would need to build shelter before spring planting, clear the brush along the south end, and get through a winter with supplies that—" He stopped. "How much do you have?" "Enough," she said. "How much is enough?" "Enough to last me until I can make the land produce," she said. "I did not come unprepared." He studied her. "You came alone." "Yes. You have no one." "I have myself," she said. "Which is the relevant party?" He looked at her across the table, and something moved through his expression that she could not quite name yet. It was not pity. She would have recognized pity and ended the conversation. It was something more complicated. It was the look of a man encountering something unexpected in a landscape he thought he knew completely, and not knowing yet whether it was a problem or a gift. He offered her the use of a spare room at the ranch house that night, since it was too late and too cold to ride back to Culver. She accepted without making it into anything, and he did not make it into anything, and Rosa showed her to the room with a lamp and a basin of water and a look that said, quietly, that this was not the strangest thing that had happened in this house, and probably would not be the last. Lillian lay in the narrow bed in the spare room and listened to the wind come off the plains and thought about Daniel. She thought about him the way she was beginning to do, not with grief exactly, which had been the mode of February and March, but with something more like gratitude mixed with sorrow, the way you feel about a good coat that finally wore out. She thought about the fact that his unmailed letter had brought her here, to this particular latitude of cold and silence, and that she was not sorry. She was frightened, which she was always careful not to show because people made decisions about you based on your fear, and she was tired, which she was even more careful not to show. And she was something else too, something new and restless that she had not felt in a long time, which was the very beginning of being interested in what happened next. In the morning, Matthew was already up. She found him at the table with maps which she had not expected, and the maps were of the county with the parcels drawn out, and her parcel was there in the center of his attention, which told her he had been thinking about it. "The brush along your south end," he said, without preamble when she came in. "It would take 2 men 3 days to clear it, and you would need it cleared before you could do anything useful. I have 2 men and 3 days before the serious cold sets in." Lillian poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove. "You are offering to clear my land. I am noting a practical situation." "Why?" He looked up. The question had clearly not been the one he expected, which suggested that in his experience offers were usually met with acceptance or refusal rather than interrogation. Because a neighbor with a cleared south field is better for the watershed than a neighbor with overgrown brush that directs runoff onto my fence line. It was a perfectly logical answer. It was also, she suspected, not the whole answer, but she was not in a position to refuse practical help, and she was not the kind of woman who refused things out of pride when pride served no one. "I will pay your men for their time," she said. "That is not necessary." "It is to me," she said. He looked at her for another of those long moments, and then he nodded. That was the beginning of something that neither of them named for a long time, which was probably wise, because the naming of things changes their shape. Over the following 6 weeks, Lillian established herself on her land. Matthew's 2 men, Jesse, who was 25 and talked constantly, and a quiet man everyone called Webb who communicated primarily through the direction of his gaze, cleared the south field in 3 days as promised. Matthew came himself on the second day, not nominally, not briefly, but for most of the afternoon, working alongside his own hands with the sleeves of his flannel shirt rolled to the elbow despite the cold, and Lillian, who was working alongside them cutting back the eastern brush, did not comment on this because it seemed unwise. She built the shelter herself mostly. It was a small structure, 1 room, with a good stone foundation she had designed from a book she had bought in Dodge City, and a timber frame that 2 men from Culver helped her raise for a fair wage. Matthew appeared at the wall raising without being asked, worked a full day, and rode back to his ranch without staying for the supper she cooked over the fire, which she noted and filed under the category of a man who was paying attention to lines. The walls went up. The roof went on before the first serious snow, which arrived in late January of 1879 with the grim purpose of a creditor who has waited long enough. Lillian had been told about Kansas winters. She had read about them. She had talked to people who had survived them. None of this was the same as being inside one. The cold was a different animal than Missouri cold. It was not merely temperature. It was weight. It was silence. It was the way the light went gray and stayed gray for days at a time, the way the wind made the walls talk in a language of complaint. She burned through wood faster than she had calculated and cut more, which was hard work but manageable. She rationed her stores carefully and found she had calculated correctly. She dealt with loneliness the way she dealt with most things, by refusing to call it by its name and keeping busy. Matthew rode over twice in January to check the creek. He said it was about the creek, about whether the creek was going to ice over in a way that would affect both their water situations. This was true. It was also, she suspected, not entirely the reason. The second time he came, in the last week of January, there was a storm building from the northwest that she had not seen coming because she did not yet know how to read this particular sky, and he knew it immediately when he looked at the horizon and he said, without theater, "This is going to be bad. How are your stores?" "Sufficient," she said. "How is your wood?" A pause. "I could use more." He helped her cut and stack for 2 hours before the storm came. And then the storm came so fast that riding back was not an option, and he stayed. He slept in his coat on the floor by the stove, and she slept in her bunk behind the curtain she had put up for privacy. And the storm came down on the plains like a living thing and shook the walls and howled through every gap in the little structure held because she had built it well. And in the morning the world was white and silent and entirely changed. She made breakfast. He ate it. They did not say anything for a while that required saying. Then he said, "You built this well." "I know," she said. And for the first time since she had arrived on his doorstep with that ruling in her hand, he almost smiled. It was the almost that undid her slightly. Not the smile itself, which she was prepared for. She was not a woman who was undone by smiles, but the almost, the thing held back, which was interesting. The way sealed envelopes are interesting because of what you suspect is inside. The snow cleared in 2 days. He went home. She thought about the almost smile for longer than she intended to, and then told herself firmly that she was being ridiculous and went back to work. February brought cold that settled into the bones of the land and stayed. Lillian developed a routine that was stringent and grounding up before light fire built. The animals seen to, she had acquired 2 horses and a small number of chickens she kept in a side hut she had added to the south wall. Then the work of the day, whatever it was, then cooking, then reading, then sleep. She had brought books from Missouri. She read them slowly, allowing herself only so many pages per evening, the way you allow yourself only so much of something good when you know the supply is finite. Matthew brought her something in February that she did not expect. He rode over on a clear, cold day and handed her, without much ceremony, a slim volume about dry land farming specific to the Kansas High Plains, published in 1875 by a man who had spent 10 years working out what grew and what did not in that particular soil. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was careful without being elegant, he had written the names of the chapters she should read first. She looked at it and then looked at him. "I found it in Culver," he said. "Figured you would want it more than I would." She thanked him. He waved it off. He stayed for an hour, and they talked about the soil composition of the south field and the water table near the creek and the possibility of sorghum versus wheat, and it was the most purely pleasant conversation she had had since Daniel died. Not because the subject was interesting, though it was, but because of the quality of attention he brought to it. He was not explaining to her. He was discussing with her, which was not a distinction men always made in her experience. He left, and she sat with the book in her lap and thought, carefully, with the discipline of a woman who had learned that the heart was not something to be given leave without supervision, that this was becoming a problem. She went to Culver in early March for supplies. The town was small: a general store, a livery, a land office, a doctor's surgery, a saloon that also served as the social center for a 30-mile radius, and a church that was used for services on Sundays and town meetings on the other 6 days. The people of Culver had accepted Lillian with the complex sociability of a small, isolated community that needed everyone who arrived to be useful and had no time for those who were not. She had been accepted as useful after the wall raising, after it became apparent she was not going to ask for help she had not earned, and after Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the general store with her husband and was the primary cultural authority of the town, had invited her to a sewing circle and found her sufficiently steady. It was at the general store in March that Lillian encountered, for the first time, the shape of Matthew Sutton's history. She was at the counter when a woman named Nora Eddings came in. Nora, who was perhaps 26, whose husband farmed the east edge of the county, and who was friendly in the way of someone who has very little adult conversation, and so values all of it greatly. Nora was the kind of woman who found silence uncomfortable and filled it with talk, and the talk was usually harmless, but it was also usually informative. "I saw Matthew Sutton ride by your place the other day," Nora said, while Mrs. Caldwell weighed out Lillian's salt. "Second time this week, was it not?" "He has concerns about the watershed," Lillian said. "Of course he does," Nora said, in the tone of someone humoring a statement they find adorable. Then more gently, "He is a good man, Matthew Sutton. A harder man than he used to be, maybe. Since Clara," Lillian did not ask. She had learned that not asking was almost always more effective than asking, because people who wanted to tell you something would tell you, and people who were going to leave it there would leave it there, and asking moved you from the first category into the second. She was right. Nora continued. "His wife," Nora said, "Clara Sutton, she died 4 years ago, just after the second winter. There was a pregnancy that went wrong and she did not recover. It was a terrible thing. They had been so well matched." She paused. "He has been alone since. He has his ranch, he has his work. He is a fair employer, people say, and he is a good neighbor mostly, and he has not been given to the usual temptations of men who are alone out here, the drinking and the rest of it. But I think he is very alone under it. It is the kind of alone that does not advertise itself." Lillian said nothing. She took her salt and her supplies and paid what was owed, and rode back to her land, and sat in her one-room house in the late afternoon light, and let the information settle into a shape that made sense. He had filed the abandonment notice on her land 3 months after Clara died, she now calculated. He had been expanding the ranch, filling space, keeping motion going the way you do when stillness is the thing you cannot afford. She was not sorry she had contested the notice. She was also, unexpectedly, not angry at him for it. She put this away. She was not a woman who moved quickly toward things or men or feelings that had not been tested. She went back to work. Spring came to the Kansas plains not gently, but with the sudden force of a reversal. 1 week the world was brown and frozen, and the next it was all noise and mud and the smell of turned earth, and the creek was running again, clear and cold, along the southern edge of her property. And Lillian stood at the edge of it on a morning in late March and felt something in her chest that was either joy or relief or both, and thought, for the first time since arriving, "I can do this." She planted in April. She had read the book Matthew had brought her carefully, had read it twice, and she planted sorghum in the south field and a kitchen garden close to the house, and left the rocky north portion fallow for now, as the book recommended, to see what it wanted to do. She kept detailed notes in a journal she had started in Missouri and continued here, noting soil conditions and weather and what she observed about the water table as the creek rose and fell through the spring thaw. Matthew came by in April on a regular pretext fence line, he said, checking where their properties met, which was a legitimate task. And she was in the south field planting when he arrived, on her knees in the dirt with her hands black with soil. And she looked up at him with the squinting look of someone coming out of focused concentration, and he looked down at her with the look of a man who has been caught caring about something before he was ready to admit it. "Sorghum," he said, looking at the rows she had laid. "According to the book," she said, "the book is right about that. Did you leave the north section?" "Fallow, yes." He crouched down at the edge of the field, picked up a handful of soil, crushed it between his fingers. "Better than I expected," he said. "There is more clay content here than the north of my place. That will hold moisture better through the dry season." "I noticed," she said. "That is partly why I put the sorghum here." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were both crouched in the dirt at the edge of her field in April with the sun coming warm off the land for the first time in months, and the moment extended itself slightly past what was strictly necessary for the exchange of agricultural information. "Supper," he said. "Saturday. I will have Rose cook. Webb and Jesse will be there, and the Caldwells, I believe, are coming out. Frank Caldwell wants to talk about the road condition on the county track." He paused. "It would be a reasonable occasion if you wanted to come." "A reasonable occasion," she repeated. "Yes. I will come," she said. She went. The supper was good. Rosa cooked the way she did everything, with a complete absence of fuss and an absolute abundance of result. And the table was full and warm, and Frank Caldwell was indeed there with his wife. And there was conversation that ranged from the road to the cattle market, to the question of the new family who had taken land 20 miles east, and whether they would stay. Webb, who rarely spoke, said 2 full sentences about the weather in a tone that suggested he had been waiting to say them for some time. Jesse talked constantly and entertainingly, as advertised. Matthew sat at the head of the table and navigated the conversation the way he navigated most things, with a quiet efficiency that kept everything moving without making itself the center of attention. And twice, in the course of the evening, Lillian looked up to find him looking at her with that same expression, the one she had been cataloging: watchful, careful, held back. And twice, he did not look away immediately, and twice she felt the warmth of it somewhere behind her sternum in a region she had been guarding carefully for some months. She rode home in the dark with the stars showing and the air still cold but carrying under the cold the smell of spring growth, and she allowed herself, during the ride, to stop guarding quite so carefully, just for those few miles, and what she felt in the absence of the guard was a longing so specific and so clean that it almost frightened her. Not the diffused longing for company or warmth that she could attribute to the winter's isolation, a specific longing for a specific person, for the particular quality of attention in a specific pair of dark brown eyes. She let herself feel it for the duration of the ride, and then, when she arrived home and tended to the horse and went inside, she put it away again. Not dismissed, not denied, just put away carefully like something valuable you are not ready to use yet. The spring moved forward. The sorghum came up. She took on a small additional income by occasionally driving supplies between Culver and two of the more remote farm operations to the east, which she did on her supply runs to save others the trip, and which paid modestly but reliably. She fixed her fence line, improved the chicken hutch, added a window to the east wall for the morning light, and read her way through the books she had and wrote letters to an old friend in St. Joseph who wrote back with news of a world that was growing increasingly distant and increasingly fine to be distant from. In May, something happened that was not expected and was not small. A man came. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, riding a horse that had been pushed too hard and wearing a suit that had been good once and now was not. And he asked around Culver for the Grayson property, which the people of Culver told him about with the careful vagueness they used for strangers, and he found his way to her land anyway. His name was Richard Foley. He was from St. Joseph, Missouri, and he had been a business associate of Daniel Grayson's. Specifically, he had been the man who introduced Daniel to Horace Gill, the land salesman, which meant he was the reason this particular parcel of Kansas existed in their lives at all. He was also, as Lillian discovered within the first 10 minutes of his presence, not here out of sentiment. There is a dispute about the original transaction, he said, sitting at her table in the way of a man who considers himself comfortable everywhere. Horace Gill's estate. Gill died last year. You may not have heard, his estate is contesting certain land sales from 75 and 76 on the grounds that the parcels were misrepresented. Misrepresented how? Lillian asked. She had not sat down. The boundaries in some cases, the water access in others. In your parcel's case, he paused, rearranged his expression to something that was performing regret while meaning something else entirely. There is a question about whether the deed included the creek. Lillian looked at him steadily. The deed includes the creek. The estate's attorney believes otherwise. What does the deed say? Well, the language is, it is somewhat ambiguous. Mr. Foley, she said, I have read that deed many times. The southern boundary is described as the center line of the creek, which means the creek is included. The language is not ambiguous. What is actually happening here? The performing regret expression dropped, and what was underneath it was closer to what she had suspected. The estate believes there is value in that creek access. The land along that watershed is worth more with the water rights. Gill sold several parcels in this area in 75, and the combined water accesses he stopped, recalibrated. There is an offer from the estate through certain parties for the land. No, she said. The figure is no, she said again. He tried the figure anyway. It was lower than she suspected the land was worth, but higher than she had paid for it, or rather higher than Daniel had paid for it. She said no again. He tried several other approaches, some of which were persuasive, and one of which was not quite a threat. It was the shape of a threat with softer material inside it, like a fist in a glove. He suggested that the legal contest could be expensive, that her resources as a widow on a new property might be strained by a protracted legal dispute, that it would be in her interest to resolve things now before they became complicated. I appreciate your concern for my interests, she said, and her voice was entirely level, and I will now ask you to leave. He left, but she knew as she watched him ride away that he was not done, Men like that were never done on the first visit. The threat was real enough. A legal contest would be expensive, and her reserves were not unlimited. And there were parties behind Foley who had more resources than she did and were not going to be deterred by a firm no. She thought about it for a day. Then, on Friday evening, she rode to the Sutton ranch. She had not been back since the April supper. Matthew was at the barn when she arrived, and when he saw her face, which she had not entirely managed to compose to its usual steadiness, he said nothing, just led her inside and sat her at the table and gave her coffee and waited. She told him about Foley. He listened. He did not interrupt, which she appreciated. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you know about the Gill estate?" "Less than I should. Horace Gill sold about 15 parcels in this county in 75 and 76, Matthew said. I know this because I looked into it when I bought my expansion land. 2 of those parcels had genuine boundary issues, bad surveys. The rest were clean. Yours is clean. The creek is yours." He paused. "But Foley is right that a contest could be drawn out." "Who is behind him?" He named no one. He would not. Matthew stood up, went to a box on the shelf, produced a letter. 3 weeks ago I received correspondence from an attorney in Wichita representing an investment group. They are buying up water access across this county. Your creek is the last piece of a connected watershed they are trying to consolidate. He handed her the letter. "They came to me first, offered to buy the creek access, not the land. I said no, and they said they would find another way." Lillian read the letter. She put it down. "They sent Foley to use the Gill estate as a mechanism." "Yes. It is clever," she said without admiration. "It is," he said. He sat back down across from her. "I have a lawyer in Wichita. A good one. I can have him file a preemptive motion establishing the deed's boundaries before the estate's attorney can file a contest. It will cost something, but it will cost less than a full contest, and it will move faster." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" The question was direct. She was a direct woman. He had been watching her for months, and he knew that, and she saw in his face that he had been waiting for this question, or some version of it, and had decided to answer it honestly. "Because you should not lose your land because a group of investors in Wichita want the water rights," he said. And because he stopped. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. "And because I have been trying to find an adequate reason to be more useful to you than the watershed gives me grounds for, and this is a clearer one." The stillness in the kitchen was the kind that has sound in it, the fire, the wind outside, something shifting in the house. Lillian looked at him for a long moment and thought about what she was feeling and what she was going to do about it, and whether this was the kind of thing she was ready for. She thought about Daniel, not with grief, but with the clear-eyed love you can have for someone once you are past the sharp edge of losing them. She thought about the book he had brought her with the chapters marked. She thought about him sleeping on the floor of her house in his coat during the January storm, and the way he had said she had built it well, as though that were the most complete sentence in the English language. "Thank you," she said. It covered several things at once. "You are welcome," he said, which covered several things too. The lawyer in Wichita was contacted within the week. His name was Hartley, and he was expensive and competent, and moved with the brisk efficiency of a man who found delays a personal insult. He filed the preemptive motion within 10 days. The Gill estate's attorney, discovering that the boundary question had already been placed before a judge with full documentation and a clean deed, pulled back and redirected his efforts to the 2 parcels that actually had surveying problems. Richard Foley did not come back. The investment group from Wichita made one more approach, through a different intermediary, offering more money. Lillian said no. Matthew, who had received his own follow-up approach, also said no. The investment group, concluding that consolidation of this particular watershed was not going to happen in the current property configuration, moved on to other parts of the county. It was over by June. June on the Kansas plains was a different world than January. The sorghum was up and looking well. The kitchen garden was producing. The creek was running clear and steady. The light lasted until nearly 9 in the evening, and the evenings were warm enough to sit outside, which Lillian did every night she could, on the bench she had built against the east wall, watching the darkness come up from the east while the west stayed light longer than seemed strictly necessary, as though reluctant. Matthew came by in June on what could no longer be fairly described as agricultural or watershed pretexts. He came by because he came by. He would appear on a Tuesday and stay for supper, and they would sit on the bench outside afterward and talk about the land, about the cattle market, about books, about Ohio and Missouri, about the particular quality of silence that this part of the world offered, which was a different silence than either of them had known before and which both of them, it emerged, had come to depend on. He told her about Clara once, carefully, with the precision of a man who has arranged his grief into something he can look at directly. She listened. She told him about Daniel with the same careful precision. He listened. What she did not say, and what he did not say, was the thing they were both thinking, which was that this particular territory of feeling was one they had each privately concluded they had finished with, and discovering that the territory was larger and more complex than they had assessed was simultaneously gratifying and disorienting, like arriving at the edge of land you thought you had fully mapped and finding more of it. It was Jesse who finally said what everyone apparently knew. Jesse, who was constitutionally incapable of leaving unsaid anything that came into his head, made a comment at the Culver General Store in late June, while Lillian was buying supplies, in the manner of someone making an obvious observation, that Matthew Sutton had not looked that way about anything since he was courting Clara, and he hoped Miss Grayson was going to do something about it before the poor man wore out the road between their two properties. Lillian told Jessie that he was impertinent and paid for her supplies and rode home and sat on her bench in the summer evening, and decided that she agreed with Jessie, which was an unexpected position to find herself in. On the first Saturday of July, Matthew arrived at her property with no pretext at all. He came in the late afternoon and found her at the fence line, doing a repair she had been meaning to get to for a week, and he got off his horse and took the tools from her and finished the repair. And when it was done, he stood at the fence and looked across her land, the sorghum standing in the south field, the kitchen garden, the small solid house with the morning light window on the east wall, and she stood beside him. "You were right," he said, "that you could do this." "Yes," she said, "I did not believe you when you first said it." "I know." He turned and looked at her. He had been preparing something. She could see a particular kind of preparation that people who are cautious about important things make, where they have thought about the words and the order of them and what they mean. And then he looked at her face, and whatever he had prepared fell apart in the particular way that prepared things fall apart when the present moment is more real and more immediate than any planned version of it. "Lillian," he said, and the word had the weight of everything he had been not saying for 6 months. "Matthew," she said, with the same weight. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was dirty from the fence repair, and held it in both of his, and the quality of that gesture, the deliberateness of it, the care in it, the lack of anything performative made her eyes sting in a way she had not expected, and would not have admitted to Jessie if he had been watching from behind a fence post, which she suspected he would have thought was a reasonable idea. "I would like," he said, "to court you properly, if you are willing." She looked at him. She thought about the winter and the spring and the storm and the supper table and the book with the chapters marked and the legal dispute and the bench outside and all the conversations that had held more inside them than their surfaces contained. "I am willing," she said. He smiled. The full version this time, not the almost the real thing, which was quieter than she had expected and much more useful. He kissed her hand, which was dirty, and she laughed, which was something she had not done in a long time in the way that laugh was, entirely unguarded, surprised out of her, and it moved across the July air and went somewhere she hoped it would stay. The courtship was conducted with the seriousness of two people who took important things seriously, and the warmth of two people who had each spent too long being serious in the wrong direction. He came twice a week and stayed for supper, and they talked and argued and walked the fence lines and sat on the bench and talked some more. And on the third visit of August, he kissed her properly at the gate when he was leaving, and she kissed him back with equal intention. And the gate was probably the most useful object in the county at that particular moment. He proposed in September, a full year after she had arrived at his barn with the ruling in her hand. He asked her in the morning on her porch without ceremony, and she said yes, also without ceremony, and they sat together on the bench for a while in the September light without feeling any particular need to add more words to what had been said. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. They were married in October, at the Culver Church, in a ceremony that was attended by a significant portion of the county because Matthew Sutton's wedding was the kind of event people were going to attend regardless of how private the principals might have preferred it. Rosa cried at the back of the church and denied it afterward to everyone who mentioned it. Jessie cried openly and did not deny it to anyone. Webb shook Matthew's hand with the air of a man who had been waiting for this outcome and was glad to see it arrive. Mrs. Caldwell, who had been watching the situation with the alert pleasure of someone following a particularly good serial, wore her best dress and told everyone in earshot that she had seen this coming from the very first day. The question of the two properties was practical, and they solved it practically. They would work both parcels, keep both titles clear, and build the operation as a combined one. The Grayson title stayed in Lillian's name. She would continue managing her land's planting and the water rights negotiations that came up periodically as the county developed. Matthew's operation remained his in structure but hers in participation, and she brought to it a precise eye for water use and soil management that improved his grazing yield in the first year by a margin that surprised him. Not that he said he was surprised. He said only that her sorghum rotation idea for the South Fields was going to work better than he had thought, which was his particular way of being surprised. They moved into the main house together, which was larger and more suited to two people than her one-room structure, and the one-room structure was given over to Jessie, who was grateful, and to his occasional use as a bunkhouse for extra hands during the busy seasons. Lillian kept her morning light window by having Matthew move the east-facing chair from his study to the kitchen, where the morning sun came in better, and she sat there in the early mornings with her coffee and her notes, and felt the peculiar happiness of having arranged the physical world to match what was needed, which was a happiness particular to people who build things. The winter of 1879 and 1880 came with the same long cold that Lillian had survived the year before, but surviving it with two people in the house was a different proposition than surviving it alone. There were two sets of hands for the wood and the animals, and the daily maintenance of warmth against the cold. There were two minds working on the problems that the winter produced. There was, in the evenings, the particular warmth of conversation that does not need to be performed because the audience already knows you, and the particular warmth of silence that does not need to be filled because the presence itself is the content. She told him in January that she was pregnant. He was at the table with the ledger books, the same posture she had first seen him in that December morning over a year ago, and she came and sat across from him and told him directly, because that was how she told people things. He put down the pencil. He looked at her. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, which was the expression of a man for whom something enormous has arrived and who does not have words for it yet and is not pretending otherwise. She put her hands over his and they stayed like that for a while. She knew he was thinking about Clara. She knew it the way you know the landscape of someone you love, not because he said it, but because she knew where the fears lived and what they looked like when they moved. She covered that too by saying steadily, "I am not a fragile woman, Matthew, and I will have the best care this county can arrange." "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely even. You are the least fragile woman I have ever met." "Then trust me," she said. "I do," he said. "I trust you with everything I have." She held on to that through the pregnancy, which was not easy. The winter was hard, and she was sick in the first months in the persistent, exhausting way that some women are, and she kept working as long as she could and rested when she had to, which was less often than Rosa thought was appropriate, and more often than Lillian wanted to admit was necessary. Matthew was present in the way that mattered, not hovering, not anxious in a way that would have driven her to distraction, but steady and attentive, and there whenever she needed him, and sensible enough to let her be when she needed that instead. Rosa managed the cooking and the heavier household work with the authority of a woman who had been doing it for years, and had her own views about how it ought to be done, which were the right views, and so nothing needed to be said. The child was born in August of 1880. A boy, which delighted Matthew in the quiet way that things delighted him, not with noise but with a visible settling, a deepening of the expression, as though the world had rearranged itself around something central. They named him James Daniel Sutton, James for Matthew's father, and Daniel for the man whose unmailed letter had started all of this. James was a large, healthy, noisy child who arrived in the world with opinions about it and expressed them at volume. He had Matthew's dark eyes and very early on Lillian's particular look of assessment, the squinting, direct, considering look that she brought to everything. Rosa called him a general. Jessie called him the boss. Webb looked at him once at length with the deep seriousness he brought to all important things, and nodded once, which was the equivalent of a speech from anyone else. Matthew held his son with the care of a man handling something precious and irreplaceable. He was not awkward with it. He was, characteristically, efficient and competent at the physical aspects of it, but the care in it, the love in it, was visible in every gesture, and it made Lillian's chest ache in the warm way that things do when they are very right. The second summer with James, the ranch turned a profit that Matthew described as good. Lillian's sorghum rotation had by now been extended to 2 of his fields and was working as she had predicted. The creek access, which had been fought over and secured and protected, proved its value that second summer when a long dry spell reduced the water table across the county, and the properties with secured creek access retained their grazing capacity while others did not. She kept detailed notes. The notes became a small document about water management on the high plains that Hartley, the lawyer in Wichita, read, and passed on to a land improvement committee that was working on county ordinances, which was an outcome she had not intended and did not publicize but was quietly satisfied by. In 1882, James was almost 2, and the world of the ranch had organized itself into something that was working, fully and well. And on a May evening when the light was long and golden over the south field and James was asleep in the house under Rosa's watch, Lillian and Matthew were sitting on the bench outside. Her bench, the one she had built against the east wall of the original structure in those first days alone. And he said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you think about Missouri?" "Sometimes," she said, "less than I expected to." "Do you miss it?" She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "I miss the version of my life I thought I would have when I was young," she said. "The ordinary version, the one that did not require all of this." She gestured at the land, the air, the distance. "But I do not miss what I actually had." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret coming here?" She turned and looked at him. The evening light was on his face, and she could see the lines that 11 years on this land had put there, and the particular quality in his eyes that she knew the name of now, that she had known the name of for 2 years and called it by that name every day without diminishing it. "Matthew," she said, "I am sitting on a bench I built with my own hands, on land I own, next to a man I love, listening to our son sleep inside a house that is warm. I have a creek and a south field of sorghum and a kitchen garden and a morning light window." She paused. "What would I regret?" He looked at her. Then he picked up her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and when he lifted his eyes there was something in them that she thought was the most complete thing she had ever been shown. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For the abandonment notice. For telling you the land was dry and the winters too long. For you told me the truth," she said. "The land is dry and the winters are long. You said you had seen longer." "I had," she said. "I saw longer in Missouri, alone and afraid and without any idea what the next year would look like. This, even the hard parts of this, is not long. This is short and bright and exactly where I am supposed to be." He held her hand and they sat in the May evening until the last light went from the west, and the stars came out over Kansas in the wide, extravagant way they did out here, where there was nothing to block them. And the sound of James stirring inside brought them both off the bench and through the door together. And that too was right. The years after that had the texture of something built well, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary struggles of land and weather and the specific difficulties of the high plains, which continued to be hard in the ways that the high plains were always hard, but sound in its foundation and growing in its depth. In 1883, they had a second child, a girl they named Clara Rose Sutton, for Matthew's first wife and for Lillian's mother, who had died when Lillian was 12. Matthew had suggested the name himself, quietly, one evening, and Lillian had looked at him and understood what it meant, that he was not carrying Clara as a shadow anymore, but as a part of the full history of himself, which is where the people you have loved and lost belong. Clara Rose was smaller than James had been, quieter, with Lillian's coloring and Matthew's patience, and she arrived in the world in March with the pragmatic calm of someone who has assessed the situation and decided it is acceptable. James, at 3, regarded his sister with the grave uncertainty of someone presented with a significant new fact and not yet sure what to do with it. He came around over the following weeks, incrementally. By summer, he had appointed himself her primary guardian and defender in a way that was more endearing than useful but entirely genuine. Rose's opinion of Clara Rose was conveyed through the speed with which she assumed the child's care when needed and the particular tenderness of her voice in the early mornings when she thought no one was listening. Jessie called her the deputy. Webb, again, looked at her for a long time and nodded once. The ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not with the reckless expansion that undid some operations in those years, but steadily and on solid ground, the way Lillian approached everything. She had a hand in all of it, the grazing rotation, the water management, the decisions about what to plant and when to sell, the conversations with the county about the road and the ordinances and the water rights that kept coming up as the region developed. She was not a silent partner in this operation. She was half of its intelligence, which Matthew stated plainly to anyone who suggested otherwise, and no one who knew them both suggested it more than once. By 1885, James was 5 and Clara Rose was 2, and the household was a busy, full, somewhat loud enterprise that suited Lillian far better than she would have predicted of herself 10 years earlier in Missouri, when she had thought of herself as a person who required quiet and order. She did require those things still. She found them in the early mornings at the kitchen window with her coffee and her notes, before the children were up and the day became what the day was. But she had discovered, with some surprise, that she also required the fullness of the life around her, the noise of it and the warmth of it, and the specific happiness of a house that contained people she loved and who were loud about existing. The summer of 1885 brought a dry spell that was the worst the county had seen in years. Not quite a drought in the full sense, but close, the kind of sustained heat and lack of rain that reduced yields and stressed the cattle and made the water question, which was always a question out here, into something more urgent. The creek ran lower than Lillian had ever seen it. She walked the watershed daily, and kept her notes with the precision of someone who understood that the data she gathered now would matter to decisions in the future. She wrote a detailed account of the water behavior over the summer and sent it to Hartley in Wichita, who had by now passed her previous document about water management on to people in the state land office who were working on the regional irrigation policy. Her account from that summer became part of a report that went before the state legislature in 1886, which was not something she had set out to do, and which she did not speak about widely, but which she was proud of in the quiet, precise way she was proud of things. Matthew, reading the report when she showed it to him, looked up with the expression she had learned to recognize as his version of astonishment, which was a very still face with slightly wider eyes, and said, "You should have told me you were writing this." "I was not writing it for any particular purpose," she said. "I was writing it because the data was there and it seemed wrong to have it and not organize it." "You organized it into a legislative report." "Eventually," she said. He shook his head, in the way of a man who has been regularly surprised by the same person for 7 years and has not yet exhausted the experience. "Lillian, Matthew." They looked at each other and both of them were trying not to smile, and neither of them was entirely succeeding, which was a dynamic that had not diminished with years and showed no sign of doing so. The dry spell broke in September of 1885 with 2 weeks of rain that was heavy enough to refill the creek and the standing water in the north field, and to cause a certain amount of damage to the lower fence lines that required repair. The repair was a 3-day job that Jesse, Webb, and 2 additional hands worked on together, and on the second day Lillian went out and worked beside them, which Jesse received with the cheerfulness of someone who genuinely enjoys company, and Webb received with the nod that was his universal acknowledgement. On the evening of the 3rd day, with the fence repaired and the rain finished, and the sky that clear, saturated blue that comes after long weather, Matthew found her at the creek. She was standing at the edge of it with her boots in the mud and her arms crossed, and her face doing the considering expression, watching the water run. "It will be down to normal levels in a week," she said without turning around, because she had heard his approach and there was only one person who moved across this land with that particular gait. "I know," he said. He came and stood beside her. They looked at the water together. "We should talk about the north field," she said. "I want to try the rotation I read about in the journal last month. If we, Lillian," he said. "Yes." He turned her around by the shoulder, gently, the way he did when he had something to say that was not about the land. She looked up at him. The evening light was on his face again, the way it always seemed to be when something important happened between them, as though the Kansas sky was making a point. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me." "I think about that day," he said. "The day you rode up with the ruling. When I came out of the barn and you were standing there, and I thought I was so certain I was right about the land, about you not being able to do it, about all of it. And you just stood there with that look you have, that look that says you have considered the situation and made your assessment, and the assessment does not favor whoever is looking at you." He paused. "I want to tell you that being wrong about you has been the best thing that ever happened to me." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. The creek ran behind her. Somewhere, James was calling something to Clara Rose in the direction of the house, the high voice of a 5-year-old convinced of the importance of whatever he was saying. The light held the world in that last golden hour before the evening came. "You told me the land was dry," she said. "You told me the winters were long." "They are," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I am still here." He kissed her with the fullness of 7 years behind it, at the edge of her creek, in the mud, with the evening coming on, and she kissed him back the way she had always kissed him, entirely, without reservation, with all the intention she brought to everything she decided mattered. When they walked back to the house, James met them at the gate with an urgent report about something Clara Rose had done with the barn cat, which required immediate parental adjudication, and Matthew lifted him onto his shoulders without missing a stride and carried him back toward the lit windows of the house, while James delivered his report from his elevated position with great seriousness. Lillian walked beside them with Clara Rose on her hip, the girl's hand in her hair in the drowsy, proprietary way of toddlers, and the lights of the house were gold in the cooling evening, and Rosa had supper on, and the smell of it came out to meet them. The years settled. The children grew. James at 7 was serious and precise, already helping with the animals in the mornings, with a focus that made Matthew say, quietly, that he was going to be a good rancher, and Lillian say, equally quietly, that he could be whatever he turned out to be, which was a distinction they had without conflict because they had always been able to disagree about things without it becoming the territory of pride. Clara Rose at 4 was curious and persistent, and had a particular gift for finding things that had been lost, which was useful enough that Rosa was known to consult her when household items went missing. In 1887, Lillian found herself in the early mornings with her coffee sitting at the east window and thinking about the next decade in the deliberate way she thought about seasons. What was coming, what was needed, what the land was telling her about its own intentions. James would be grown in 15 years, Clara Rose in 17. The ranch was solid, the land was producing. The water question had been partly resolved at the county level by the ordinances that had, in their indirect way, drawn on her observations. There was, she noted, a restlessness that she recognized not as dissatisfaction but as capacity, the feeling of someone who has built one thing and is ready to think about what comes next alongside it. She talked to Matthew about it one morning, in the way she talked to him about important things, which was directly and expecting a real response. He listened and then said, "The school." She looked at him. "The school in Culver is going to lose its teacher in the spring," he said. "Mrs. Prentice is going east. I heard it at the general store last week. They will need someone to teach until they can find a permanent teacher." He paused. "You taught letters in Missouri." "I taught the neighbors' young children," she said. "That is not quite the same." "You could teach the county's children," he said, "which is more the same than not. You have the notes, you have the knowledge, you have—" He stopped. "You have the look that makes people pay attention." She tried not to smile and managed it about as well as she usually did. "You think I should apply?" "I think you should do what you want to do," he said. "But if what you want to do is that, then I think you should," she applied. She was offered the position within 2 weeks, on the condition that she would commit to at least 1 full school year while Culver searched for a permanent appointment. She accepted on the condition that the position paid what the previous teacher had been paid, which was a figure they named. And she said yes when she confirmed it was accurate by asking 3 parents separately. She taught at the Culver School through the spring of 1887, and the following full year, riding into town on the school days with James on the horse behind her, since he was now old enough for school himself, and regarded his mother as his teacher with the particular complex pride and mortification of 7-year-olds whose parents are authority figures in their own spaces. She was, as Matthew had predicted, good at it. She was precise and fair and expected effort, and she was also, on the days when the material was interesting and the children were with her, genuinely lit up by it in a way that the children responded to with the instinct children have for real engagement versus performance. The permanent teacher arrived in September of 1888, a young man from Iowa named Fellows who was 23 and earnest and well-prepared, and Lillian handed the position over to him with a comprehensive set of notes about each of the students, their particular strengths, the specific areas needing attention, the approaches that worked best for each, that Fellows was known to have read twice and kept on his desk all year. She went back to the ranch with the feeling of someone who has loaned something valuable and gotten it back changed in a good way. She went back with a clearer sense of what she wanted to do with the particular set of things she was good at, which was not necessarily teaching itself, but the organization of knowledge for use, the writing of it, the recording of it, the making of it accessible. She wrote. She had always kept notes. Now she began to write more deliberately, about the land and its management, about water and soil, and the specific knowledge she had gathered over 10 years on these 90 acres. She wrote it in the same way she did everything precisely, without excess, with the goal of making the information useful to someone who was starting where she had started. Matthew read it as she wrote it and made observations, some of which she incorporated, and some of which she argued with at the supper table while James and Clara Rose ate their beans and observed their parents argue with the comfortable recognition of children who know that this is what intelligent love looks like. In 1890, James turned 10 and was, as Matthew had predicted, already remarkable with the animals, patient with the horses, precise with the cattle, quietly confident in the fields in a way that suggested the land was already speaking to him in the language it spoke to people who belonged to it. Clara Rose turned 7 and was in Fellows' school and was, Fellows reported at the fall meeting, exceptionally fast with numbers and had a habit of correcting him on the arithmetic when he made demonstration errors on the board, which she did politely and accurately, and which he had learned to receive graciously. Lillian, hearing this, looked at Matthew across the meeting hall with an expression that was entirely neutral and contained a great deal of satisfaction. That winter was a hard one, the kind that the plains produced periodically to remind everyone that it was still capable of the worst. But they had 11 years of preparation behind them now. The wood stores were deep, the animals were sheltered, the food stores were carefully calculated and accurate, and the house was warm. Matthew and Lillian sat by the fire in the evenings while the children slept and the wind did what it did, and talked the way they had always talked about everything, about nothing, about the next season and the next decade, and the stories they had heard, and the things they had read and the specific internal landscape of two minds that had been companionable for more than a decade and had not yet found the edges of each other's territory. In one of those evenings in February of 1891, she told him she was expecting again. She said it the same way she had said it the first time, directly across the table, and he looked at her with the same expression he had worn 11 years ago, the enormous contained feeling that he had never found adequate words for. And then he said, with a smile that was the full version unheld, "The world continues." "It does," she said. "It apparently prefers to." He got up and came around the table and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the warmth of him in the way of someone who has been doing this long enough that it is as natural as breathing. And they sat by the fire while the Kansas winter came down outside and held none of its usual threat. The third child was born in September of 1891, another boy, and they named him William Thomas Sutton, William for no particular lineage, but because it suited him, and Thomas for Matthew's grandfather, who had come from England with nothing and built something in Ohio, which was the kind of origin story Matthew carried with quiet pride. William arrived with the same large, healthy noise that James had brought, and James, now 11, received his brother with the seriousness of someone who understands the responsibilities of an older sibling, and Clara Rose, 8, received him with the decisive certainty of someone who had already planned what kind of relationship they were going to have and was prepared to organize it accordingly. The household with 3 children was different from the household with 2, in the way that specific things are different not because of quantity, but because of configuration. 3 people created triangles and alliances and negotiations that 2 people did not, and the noise level increased in ways that were not strictly mathematical, and Rose's authority over the kitchen became, if anything, more complete. Because in a household with 3 children and 4 adults, the kitchen was the one reliable, stable institution. Jessie, who had been with the ranch since the beginning, was now engaged to a woman named Mary who was from a family in the eastern county, and they married in the spring of 1892, and Jessie moved from the bunkhouse to a small homestead 2 miles east that Matthew helped him purchase with the accumulated wages that Jessie had saved with a discipline that surprised everyone except Mary, who had apparently always known. Jessie still worked the Sutton operation on a part-time basis, and still talked constantly, and was now the subject of considerable delight to James and Clara Rose and William, who found his inexhaustible commentary on the world to be one of the more entertaining features of their landscape. Webb, who remained, was now 50-something, and had the authority of an elder without any of the ceremony of it. He was still the best at reading the weather, the cattle, and the land, and he still communicated primarily through nods and the direction of his gaze, and he still looked at important things: newborns, first plantings, the height of the creek in late summer, with the long considered attention of someone for whom looking is a form of thought. Lillian's writing found its way into print in 1893, when a journal on agricultural development published a piece she had written about water management on the high plains, drawing on 15 years of documented observation from her own land and the surrounding watershed. Matthew bought 3 copies in Culver and showed them to everyone he could reasonably reach, with a restraint that lasted approximately 2 days before Webb pointed out that he had shown the same copy to the same 3 people twice, and Matthew accepted this observation and showed it to 3 more people instead. Lillian was 46 when William started school. James was 16 and was already doing a full man's work on the ranch, and was beginning to have opinions about the cattle management that were worth hearing. Clara Rose was 13 and was burning through every book in the county at a rate that suggested she was going to exhaust the local supply and require resupply from further away. William was 6 and had the particular enthusiasm for everything that 6-year-olds had when the world was still undifferentiated in its interest, and he had his mother's eyes, the light gray, direct ones, and Matthew's patience, and an entirely independent personality that had not yet declared its full intentions. There was a morning that year in October when Lillian woke before dawn, as she always did, and came to the kitchen and made the coffee and sat at the east window waiting for the light. The land outside the window was dark still, but the sky was beginning very slightly at the edge to distinguish itself from the night. James was asleep. Clara Rose was asleep. William was asleep. Matthew was asleep. She could feel the warmth of his absence still in the air of the kitchen, the way the room held the heat from the night. She sat with her coffee and looked at the approaching light and thought simply, without agenda, "I have been here 16 years." 16 years since she had arrived at the barn with the ruling in her hand, and the exhaustion behind her eyes and the iron in her chin, and the long dark silence of a Missouri winter still in her bones. 16 years since he had told her the land was dry and the winters long, and she had said she had seen longer. The light came up slowly over the eastern edge of the plains, the flat, clean light of a Kansas October morning, and it moved across the south field where the sorghum had been cut and the soil was resting, and it moved across the fence line they had repaired together, and it moved across the creek that she had fought for and protected and written about and used, and it reached the window where she sat and came in warm on her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment and felt it. She heard him come in behind her, the particular step, the familiar weight of him in the kitchen, and she did not open her eyes yet. She heard the sound of him pouring coffee. She heard him sit down across from her. She opened her eyes and looked at him in the morning light, and he was looking at her with the expression she knew the name of, the one she had been the recipient of for 16 years, and it had not changed and had only deepened, the way good things do with time. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Outside, the light was fully arrived now, moving across everything, and the land was there in all its particular stark beauty: the wide sky, the dry grass, the creek catching the light along its length, the distance that had once been frightening and was now just the shape of home. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the kind of question he asked occasionally, not from doubt but from the genuine one of knowing. She looked at him, and at the land, and at the kitchen that Rosa had made efficient and Lillian had made warm, and at the door beyond which James and Clara Rose and William were sleeping in the deep trust of children who have always been safe. "Yes," she said. Simply, completely, the way she said things she meant entirely. "Are you?" "Immeasurably," he said. The morning held them there, at the kitchen table, with the coffee and the light and the sound of the land waking up outside, and everything that had been survived and built and loved and grown in 16 years of Kansas winters and dry summers and full harvests and cold barns and supper tables, and evening benches and documents and legal battles and children and arguments, and the particular, irreplaceable intimacy of two people who have chosen each other every morning since the morning they began. Immeasurably, he had said. She thought, yes, that was the word. Outside, the creek ran south. The sorghum field rested in the October light, patient and dark with the year's work done. The sky was so clear and so enormous that it seemed to contain several futures at once, and none of them frightened her, and all of them were possible, and she was home,